your boyfriend has begrudgingly invited you on a trip to Sweden, and you get there and things are not all what they seem, and you go into a cabin and surprise, it's a Spooky Time Club.
Oh, welcome to season 2 of the Spooky Time Club.
It's
everybody.
The most wonderful time of the year.
The most wonderful. Now that we're done with the part that the singing and the gift giving and the feasting, now we can get back to focusing on spooky time.
And
stuff.
I want to know if you can guess what we're talking about today.
Yeah. And really, so that all you folks who are brand new to the program know, that over there, it's been so long I forgot how to point. That's Rebecca.
Hello. And that
so,
Leigh.
now that you know how hard it is to point the right direction when this screen's been flipped. Spooky Time Club. We're a licensed program from the Geekshow podcast, which broadcasts live every Saturday morning at 11:30. That's Mountain Time, so just add or deduct time from that if you're not familiar with the Mountain Time Zone. But we get together every once in a while and talk about spooky time stuff, whether it's newer spooky time stuff or older spooky time stuff. This one's a little bit on the older side, but not like old, just a few years past.
Yeah,
right?
like 2019, I think. You would think I would know.
And it's a Ari Aster production. He wrote and directed. It's Midsommar, which is the proper Swedish pronunciation of Midsommar. And I watched it finally. Rebecca's been trying to get me to watch it for years. And we thought we'd start season 2 of the Spooky Time Club with a look at this incredibly unnerving movie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. I'm not exaggerating when I say this is my favorite movie. I don't watch it all the time because it is grim. But it's the way the movie is made and the content and what I took away from it that makes it my most favorite movie. As you can see, I've got this shirt. I got I pulled all my Midsommar art to bring it like front and center. I got my little bear right there. And
you have a hollowed out bear carcass in the corner to keep your husband on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, you cannot see it though. Because it's too gory.
So it hit interestingly for me because I was an anthropology major in college, and my emphasis of study was on culture and comparative religion. So this was a trip. Also, I'm 65% Swedish.
Oh.
It was nice to see the old country represented so nicely.
So I do want to say, before we get like into the real nitty gritty of the movie, yesterday, so we're recording this on the 4th. Yesterday, January 3rd, was Florence Pugh's birthday.
Well, one of the best actors alive, young or old, right now.
She is incredible. Yeah. I read a description of her as someone who's not afraid to use her face. Yeah. And love it. I love it for her.
Yeah, my youngest always says that when the cartoon version of a frown shows up on her face, get ready for some amazing acting to happen. And this, we actually see it. It's a tiny little upside down U that shows up 2 or 3 times in the movie. And right after that, some sort of screaming or wailing or ululating actually shows up. So in a nutshell, the story is about Danny, played uncannily well as an American character by Florence Pugh. She's not American, for those of you who do not know. And she's in a relationship with, for lack of better words, a total dickhead named Christian.
He's the boyfriend who I've been in Christian's position before. I have been in a relationship where I didn't want to break up with the person because I didn't want to hurt their feelings, and I didn't want to face confrontation, essentially.
We've all been there, sure. Yeah.
And the lead up to it, the whole basis of their relationship is his friends keep telling him to break up with her, and
so they can go get laid somewhere else.
And she's an unnecessary emotional drag, and he just doesn't have the emotional intelligence to cope with it, and just keeps stringing her along as she's trying her best to get through, spoiler alert, the loss of her family.
Well, and that's an interesting thing too, because her sister's bipolar, and that's what she's so freaked out about, is that her sister's bipolar. If you don't know about bipolar disorder, it is a fascinating thing to explore, but a terrible thing to go through, because the highs are really high and the lows are super low. And her sister's constantly threatening to take her own life. And this time around, the text is, "Mom and Dad are coming too." And that's what happens. And it's not a gentle little off screen. You don't see the actual act, but my goodness, that
right
is
there, and it's brutal, and the music composition that goes along with it too is just so unsettling. And
the music did an amazing job of keeping you off center through the entire movie. There's nothing tranquil about it. All of the music, no matter whether it's gentle townsfolk chanting or whatever else, it's all just slightly sinister. But yeah, the sister's death is the most. I actually, in hindsight, really have to thank Ari Aster for making it as brutal as it is. I mean, it's not bloody, it's not gory,
but it's bloody, but it's creepy.
It's horrifying.
It is horrifying.
It sets a tone. It really does set a tone. And so the whole backup is that Christian and his friends Pelle, Josh, and Mark are headed to Sweden to check out. I think I forgot another person there. Did I forget another person there? I forgot. No, Josh. No. Yeah. Okay. So Josh, Pelle, and Mark, you don't find this out until most of the way through the movie. They're anthropology majors. They're writing their theses about anthropology. And so
Christian, key to his character, has not decided on a thesis yet.
Well, he doesn't have an original thought. He seems like all of those charming pretty boys or semi-pretty boys that kind of skate through life letting everybody else do everything for them, right? So,
which is exactly why he hasn't broken up with Danny, because it's something he has to do, and because it's emotional work, he's not going to do it.
And it's wild because he makes two decisions in this movie. We'll get to later. He makes two decisions in this movie, and both of them are fairly catastrophic, because one of them shows you who he is, and then the last one is just like, dude, you could have said no, and maybe you would have been okay. Yep. Who's to say? Because you hadn't really done anything wrong. But they're going to go to Pelle's village because he's been talking about this Midsommar rite that his family participates in every year, and it's really idyllic. And Christian, being the ultimate flaccid whatever that he is, passively says that he invited Danny and passively insists that his friends go along with it, and Danny just decides to go along. But
and I think too, like, he invites Danny because they go to a party, and she overhears that they're talking about going, and she's like, "Oh, I didn't know you agreed to go."
Right. And it's one of those things, guys, if you can't figure out why your relationship isn't working and you're not actually communicating things to your partner.
And in order to appease her, he just passively invites her along, and she's like,
"Come along, it'll be great."
Okay, I guess.
And she's just, there's a couple shots in her mix there where she's just openly grieving. I mean, grief is like the scar tissue that your soul carries with you everywhere that you go, right? So she's just obviously wounded and wailing and face acting. And then they land in Sweden. They end up at Pelle's, at the field before Pelle's village, and everybody decides they want to take some mushrooms.
Well, yeah, and mushrooms they're a big part of this journey.
Yes.
Which I wouldn't learn to appreciate until 2021,
Really? Well, yeah. I can obviously say, as somebody who's experienced exactly that, they did a very good job of showing the visual representation, like the nature breathes a little bit, and
the way
you can feel that.
Things move, like he did a really phenomenal job of capturing that.
And it's so subtle, like my wife didn't catch it the first time through. It wasn't actually towards the end when there was another drug trip where the flowers are breathing.
Towards the end is when you can really catch it. Yeah.
So again, she's not having the easiest time of things, but I'd like to mention that so far the only decent dude in the movie has been Pelle, this Swedish guy, because he seems to really care about her.
Yeah, because you've got Pelle, who he's a very caring guy, and he actually, when she's like first invited or whatever, he's like, "Hey, like I can't remember exactly, but he goes out of his way to actually talk to her. Whereas all of other Christian's other friends, you got Will Poulter, who's a jackass.
Oh,
and
that's Mark. And
Mark and
Mark's
then,
that dude that I always want to smack.
Yeah, well, yeah, and he plays that character so well. And then you have Josh, played by William Jackson Harper, who he is just there for this thesis. Like, he doesn't really give a shit.
I didn't recognize him until about 2/3 of the way through the movie. And it's so funny because I didn't recognize his face. I recognized his back muscles from The Good Place.
Because the guy's ripped.
The guy is ripped. But, he's wearing a shirt. He's all buttoned up and proper. But then I saw him turn around at one point and I was like, oh, that's Chidi. I appreciate a good back muscle. So that's so they get to the village where they're promptly met by this. It's just so idyllic, and the houses are so nice, and the children are running free and happy
and very aesthetic.
It's like what you wish IKEA was, right? So. And you meet Father Odd, and you're introduced to this kind of matriarchal society.
And you're introduced to culture. You're introduced to a whole new culture, and that's something because there's a culture shock that I think you are meant to kind of experience, but also go through at the same time as like everybody else, right? Like, they have their own rites, they have their own rituals, and of course you don't know those right away.
No.
But you learn about them the hard way.
Well, and I grew up, so for a little flavor, I grew up in Los Angeles, and a lot of my extended family are Latin American. So I became very aware very early on that my immediate family had no particular culture. We were just white people adrift in Los Angeles. And whereas like my extended family would go to Olvera Street, we'd celebrate, and feasts and birthdays and weddings were a 2-day affair. And there's nothing really bland about it. And my wife's family's German, and they have these very intense cultural significant things, like explaining to you folks at Geekshow that Christmas Eve is a huge deal. It's like an all-day event. You cook, you spend time with the family, all this other stuff. But most American culture is so homogenized, and the culture's been kind of beat out of us. There's a Gogo Bordello song called American Wedding that I love that kind of shows the contrast between like Eastern European culture and standard American culture, right?
I was kind of lucky growing up because my own family culture, what is that? But we had family friends that I call them my second family because they practically raised me 50% of the time.
Right.
But they took me on trips with them to Sweden and Norway and Finland, and they are Finnish and Swedish, so I would go with them every year to the Santa Lucia thing, wherever it was hosted here in Salt Lake. And so I had an appreciation already for like Swedish culture, and felt like I was like, I have a basic understanding, I think.
This is the old shit, and this is also where it becomes very apparent that Christian is named Christian for a reason, because it's definitely she's got the boyfriend, she's got the apparent stability of this flaccid relationship, and then she has this community that might seem a little strange because the young folk live in one house and the older folk live in their own homes, and then the older folk, as Pele says, he does the finger thing and everybody laughs, and as we find out a little later, that's not necessarily something they laugh about. But
something else too about Pele versus Christian. Danny mentions that it's her birthday when they get there, and Christian has done nothing. He hasn't even acknowledged it. But Pele has drawn her a picture and given it to her for her birthday. Yeah. And then the guys remind Christian that it's her birthday, and he gets her like a cake or whatever. And she's like, gee, thanks, I guess.
Yeah, because where would every douche bro be without their posse to keep them on the straight and narrow, right? So, anyway, that's like my native enemy in the wild is the douche bro. So if you ever see me like randomly hunting someone, it's because it's douche bro season. And they should be everybody's natural enemy, right? So things progress. They end up going to, I can't remember what the name of the rite is, but the anthropology bros all know exactly what it is. Danny has no idea because she's not an anthropologist, and it's basically
and it's very secretive. And William Jackson Harper, he's very much like, oh really? Oh, you guys are in for a treat.
Yeah, but I don't think he watched
it
like
really knew.
Okay. So that you folks know, if you don't have a history in anthropology is literally the prime directive. You cannot interfere. You are there to observe and to document. And so for them to do what they did, the anthropology bros just basically watched the scene, except for Mark, because he took off, because Mark's a idiot. But basically, these two old folks were carted up on a couple of palantirs, and then they threw themselves off a cliff to die. And the lady dies immediately. The dude, not so much.
When his death is brutal.
Yeah, it is brutal. It's and not only is the death brutal, but like his bad landing on the sacrificial rock is pretty bad.
He lands like on his feet, and that is not how you want to land when you jump off a cliff.
It's kind of like if you threw a whole boiled turkey at a wall at 70 miles an hour is basically what his leg looked like. And so the townspeople, 3 of them show up with the big smacking hammer, and they cave his head in. But here's what I found fascinating. This is the first time I noticed it. Prior to this, the only emotion we really see is kindness from Pele, kindness from the Swedes, and anguish and grief from Danny. At this point, everybody in the village starts screaming in agony because their people are suffering. And so here you have these weirdos. Here you have these pagans that were supposed to be going, oh, how strange, how weird.
Because runes are everywhere, too.
Yeah. But they're feeling the pain and the anguish of their townsfolk, of their family, and that's really quite touching. But what they do is kind of horrific, right? So, where does it go from there? It's
from there. There's I don't want to give away like the whole movie, but there's a whole series of events of essentially these anthropology bros disrespecting the culture. Mark pisses on their ancient familiar tree. They hint at a game called Skin the Fool. There's one person within the community who is obviously a result of incest. And that's one of the conversation topics too, is this is the same community for generations. How do you get fresh blood in? Because this group of anthropology majors, they're not the only group that has been brought in too. A bunch of other people have also been brought in from, like, there's a couple from England, and it's an experience. It's a tricky way to introduce new genes into the gene pool.
And it's also an interesting way to talk about a couple of things. Again, I think Ari Aster understands his anthropology, because at one point Josh says, hey, what about the incest taboo? Because that's a big thing you learn in Anthro 101, and it carries through all anthropological study, is that every culture has an incest taboo. There's not a single culture out there that looks at incest and says, hey, that's a good idea, let's do it. And it's because I think
except maybe the royals.
Well, that's not a culture. That's just rich people being rich. So, and intermarriage in European society, they just want to keep it royal, right? That's
keep it within the bloodline.
Keep it in the bloodline. So Josh is actually talking to one of the village elders about the incest taboo, and he's like, "Oh, we don't do that." And then they cut to another scene where somebody's talking to, and I think it might have even been Josh, talking to the guy in the library, and he's like, "Oh, well, our town wise man is actually the result of lots of inbreeding." Oh my gosh. And
they even say, he's like, because Josh is like, can I take pictures of like your texts or whatever? And they're like, no. And so of course he goes and does it anyway, and he faces consequences.
And that's where I think, and it's fascinating, because they don't spell it out for you. You ultimately end up, I think, you get this question in your mind that if they didn't do the things that they did, if they would have faced the consequences that they faced, right? Because the only one who doesn't do anything, well, you don't know with Connie, and I can't remember Connie's, Simon and Connie, the British couple. They disappear at one point, and even to the point where Christian's being a douche about the whole thing, because Simon leaves first, and Danny's really bothered by why would Simon leave first, and Christian's like, well, I would leave. But I don't know what they may or may not have done other than freaking out and being jackasses. But
I think it, like I said, it's been a while since I've actually watched the movie, but I think what happens is they just get freaked out enough that they want to leave.
Yeah,
and so
and
they are like,
leave.
okay, we'll help you leave.
We'll help you leave, boy.
Fertilizer for our crops.
So we'll go into spoiler territory, because the movie has been out for a few years, so we're not going to worry about that too much. So it turns out the whole thing is they're going to dub a May Queen, and
which they do every year. There's a May Queen every year.
But this one's a big one, because it's the first time in 70 years that a certain number of things have come into play, and they really, you can tell Pele really wants Danny to be the May Queen, and so she drinks her magic mushroom broth and she dances with the other girls. And
it's the last person standing. They do this like Danny, because Danny even says, she's like, I don't know how to speak Swedish, I don't know how to dance, and they're like, you're doing it now, and she's like, oh, okay.
There's a great bit that anybody who's ever done psychedelics has experienced, where you start talking gibberish to somebody else and they understand you perfectly.
And they go, yeah.
Damn straight. So she ends up being the last person standing.
Yeah, they do their dance around the maypole, and she's the last one standing, and then while all of this is happening,
douche bro's got a douche bro.
There's a woman within the village who takes a liking to Christian.
Maya.
And the another amazing thing about this movie is there are no spoilers if you know what to look for, because at the very beginning of the movie there's a big tapestry that portrays the whole movie, and then later on in the movie there's another tapestry that shows this love potion spell thing, and as she trims her pubes and period bleeds into a drink and gives it to Christian in order, she's trying to, magic love potion him, essentially.
Right. Which you don't know if it works or not. They hint that it does.
Yeah. Because, again, this is all part of the ploy of bringing new genes into the gene pool.
Right.
And so she kind of lure Christian, also tripping on mushrooms, by the way, and he's having a hard time.
But he was handed that drink and hesitated. That's where I get to that whole, could he have turned that away and not face the consequences that he faced? His consequences were the most entertaining to me out of all of them, because again, I disliked him the most.
Yeah. So. Well, because another shitty thing that he does is he's like, I'm going to do my thesis on these people too.
The same one that Josh wants to.
And Josh is like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And calls him out on it. Anyway, so Josh essentially Christian gets lured into this cabin where he's coerced into having sex with Maya.
He really didn't push too hard, did
he? Nope. He was like, okay, I guess this is happening now.
Yep.
And they're not alone. The village, half of the village is there too. All naked. Yeah. Also, if you remember when the elderly people jumped off the cliff and everybody else was like crying in agony and pain, these people also crying in joy and pleasure along.
They're feeling everything.
They're sharing in their feelings.
Yeah.
So Danny wins May Queen, and they're like, Danny, we have something to show you. Come on. And they take her over to the cabin where Christian is, and she peeks through
this is amazing. They take her to the house of the May Queens, but they drop her litter that she's in halfway between where the May Queen's house is and where Christian's up to no good at, literally close enough that they can hear what's going on. And I loved that, because I was watching it and I was like, oh, well, they're going to go do May Queen business. And then they literally put it in between the two houses. It's like, oh no, don't go there. Disregard this completely.
There is a part, I'll have to send you a screenshot, but there's a part where they're carrying her on the litter and she's decked out. If you look at the trees behind you, it shows her sister's face with the mask on.
Oh, interesting.
In the trees.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so creepy. It's very cool.
Yeah, and at this point, for those of you wondering about the look of it, if you're one of those people who doesn't pay attention to a movie, you realize that the trees are breathing, the grass is breathing, the flowers are all opening and shutting on Danny's headdress. Beautiful stuff. Unsettling.
Super cool.
Yeah.
So Danny sees Christian having sex with Maya, and she understandably freaks out. And so she goes and she has a meltdown. But then all of the other women who were participating with her in the May Queen ceremony come and join her and wail with her and agonize with her. And it's really unsettling to watch if you're not in touch with your emotions, honestly.
Right. And also if you've never been through an actor's training program, because that is a basic actor's exercise. But when you put a group of people screaming like that and wailing, it's very, very powerful stuff. And part of the reason why they do it for actors training, and seeing them take that and say, okay, well, let's make this about the grief and destruction of a relationship. Because I think she always knew Christian was going to be that way, but actually being confronted with it is so horrific, right?
Yeah.
So powerful stuff. Then we find out what happened to everybody
else,
and it's beautiful.
They reference the game Skin the Fool at the very beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
Mark is the fool when he gets skinned, and he gets worn, essentially.
He's wearing a jester's cap when they bring his body in.
Simon, his it's so creepy just what they do. Like
it's called the Blood Eagle.
Yeah, he's flayed and
it's Connie, only been referenced, the Blood Eagle's only been referenced a couple times in Scandinavian folklore, and it's basically a person is strung up. They're hung up so that they're facing down. Their whole body's facing down. The rib cage is removed from the back, and the lungs are pulled out of their back to resemble wings. And so there's a lot of debate as to whether it's real. But I'm not quite sure what he did to deserve that. But he's still alive when they find him.
Yeah, I took away, like, it's all ritual. It's all ritual stuff, right?
Right.
And especially the end thing, what they do, because you can see they have this big yellow triangle cabin also, and they ask, "What is that?" And they're like, "Don't worry about it."
Yeah.
And
don't pay attention to the giant yellow building.
And also, when they first arrive to the village, there's a bear in a cage, and Mark is like, What's with the bear? And they're just like, it's a bear, and go about their business.
Yeah.
So they have like a big like feast or whatever. But anyway, so you learn what happens to everybody. And William Jackson Harper, he gets stuffed kind of like a scarecrow, I think.
He's stuffed with one of their sacred books.
Oh.
Looked like. Yeah. And because his mouth lit on fire first. So whatever was in his mouth, it looked like rolled up paper had been shoved in his mouth. And
but Christian, they drug him, so he cannot move.
Yeah.
And Danny is presented with a choice. There's one more person that needs to go into the cabin. Who's it gonna be? Danny.
It's a pretty easy answer.
And she picks Christian because fuck that guy. Right. And Christian, what they do is they kill the bear, hollow out the bear, and put Christian in the bear. And so they wheel everybody into the cabin and set the cabin ablaze. And the rest of the village is crying and screaming in agony too, and in celebration too, because this is part of their tradition.
It's the end of the Midsommar. Yeah.
And it's just a big celebration, and Danny smiles very creepily there at the end, I think because she's found her community and
she found her family, right?
She found her family. I mean, if I was in Danny's position, I would stay. Yeah. I would stay. I have nothing left for me in the United States.
Well, there's nobody there telling her to shush. There's nobody there absent-mindedly patting her back while she's wailing over the loss of her family. I also feel like if she had chosen one of the townspeople, they would have gone through with it, but I think she would have died.
Oh, interesting.
Because by getting rid of Christian, she got rid of the contamination of the outside world and became part of the family. And then you get, interestingly enough, there's parallels to interesting things. There's ways that people died elementally. So you have people that died of earth. You have people that died because Josh was buried in the soil. At one point, you see his foot sticking out of the ground like a demented tulip. Someone was drowned. Another person was hung in the air. Another person was burned alive. So, but you also have parallels to the tarot, whereas Josh was the Hierophant, he died for knowledge. Oh, you have a Midsommar tarot?
These are from my friends at Ewgrossrebecca.
Awesome. Okay. I am so glad I am not original in that thought. Just psychologically more horrifying than it is any other way. Like it's an emotional trip, it's a psychological trip, and it's disgusting as hell at some points, but it's not a scary movie.
No, it's not scary. It's
unsettling.
Horrifying. Yeah. Here's the reason I love this movie so much. I saw this movie, I'm in the peak of therapy and learning to access my own emotions and understand that it's okay to have emotions. And so I really related a lot to Danny. There's a lot of moments in the very beginning of the film where she excuses herself to go grieve by herself, and she will not allow herself to be publicly sad, and she tries to push it down as much as she can. But then she is embraced by this community that not only accepts her, but also grieves openly with her and teaches her essentially that it is okay to feel your feelings, and we encourage it. That for me was a huge takeaway. And it's the reason I love this movie, because for me, it's been part of my emotional journey in letting myself experience my feelings and acknowledge that it's okay to have feelings too. But just, being part of this welcoming community that promotes that, I was so just like in love and blown away.
And you kind of have to lose that sense of self to a certain degree, sacrifice certain elements of yourself to get there, right? So in some ways, if you want to get into the big oogie boogie part of it, a lot of the people that were there in the village with her are almost symbolic of outdated ways of thinking that she needed to get rid of before she could sacrifice the self and become reborn in the sense of community,
allowing yourself freedom. To be vulnerable too, because that's a huge part of it. People don't like to be vulnerable, and she, especially in the beginning when she would excuse herself to go be by herself, she doesn't want to
in the
be
airplane
vulnerable.
Lavatory, right?
Yeah.
It's another thing that I find fascinating is Western culture's inability to be, and it's not even just Western. There's some parts of Eastern culture that don't allow vulnerability too, and it's so tightly tied into workforce productivity. We can't allow people to be vulnerable or emotional because that takes away from how productive they are during the workday. So if people were to feel the impact of a lost family member or to feel the impact of a lost relationship, and have to deal with that and to cope with that, it can be incredibly disruptive to the workforce. So we've made it, over the last 150 years, highly undesirable to be emotional people. So that's my take on it, at least. So I'm so glad you recommended this to me. I was expecting something completely different and came away from something that was very thought-provoking. Despite,
I'm glad you liked it. I'm really glad you liked it.
Yeah, we've met a few people whose, for lack of better words, entire personality became Midsommar, not because they loved it, but because they identified with some part of it that they just kind of transitioned to Midsommar core. And I'm like, okay, that's a little unnerving, because what part are you identifying with?
Well, I'm like, that's why people get weird when I tell them that Midsommar is my favorite movie. And I'm like, It's not my favorite movie for the reasons you think. It's not just because I like creepy, gory horror things. I mean, I do, but it's not like Evil Dead's my favorite movie, right? Like, I'll watch it, but it's not my favorite movie. I love this movie because I took something away from it and it made me feel something.
And that's good cinema.
That's fantastic. And I love Ari Aster. I think he's so talented. And he wrote this after a breakup in which he fully admits, he's like, yeah, I messed up. I was the bad guy in this breakup.
This is my breakup movie.
Yeah, and it's his breakup movie. And I don't know. I just love it. I love it a lot. And I'm so glad you liked it.
I did. I will not watch Hereditary, though, because
spooky.
Generational family trauma is something that I don't handle well, which is the other reason why the trailer for the new Evil Dead movie has left me feeling like my skin's crawling off my back. There's some things I need to unpack with a licensed professional when it comes to generational trauma.
Yeah, and Hereditary is fun to watch because it was filmed in Utah, and so there's aspects of it that are in Park City, and then other parts that are in like a physical apartment building on South Temple that I used to clean. Oh, wow. And so I'm like, hey, I know this apartment. I know the exact layout of this apartment. But it's kind of fun because she goes to an art supply store that's in Park City and then goes to her house that I'm like, that's all the way in Salt Lake. If we're talking region, this does not make sense. But it's fun to watch if you're a local. But yeah, it is specifically generational trauma, and it's nuts. Yeah.
And that's a thing that we here in the West have not been conditioned to deal with at all, and we've all got it, whether we want to admit it or not.
Oh yeah, I tell everybody, I'm like, your problems go back to your parents. Like,
and
it
their
just
problems
is
go
that
back
way.
to theirs. Yep.
Yeah, it just is that way.
We trace it back to the Great Depression, and it goes
the
on
cycle
even farther.
Stops with you
if you want it
but
to.
You have to understand where it comes from.
Exactly. So, this is probably the bigger, deepest thinking segment of Spooky Time Club we've done, and it might be the biggest, deepest thinking that we will do. It's hard to say, but we appreciate you all for tuning in. And again, remember, like, subscribe. Make sure to catch us live on Saturdays with the Geek Show podcast. And in the meantime, keep it spooky. I've been Leigh.
I've been Rebecca.
See ya.
Ooh, bye.